Washington can make a DHS budget fight sound like paperwork. A leadership fight can sound like one more round of political theater. But if this drags on, most Americans will not feel it first in a Senate hearing or a press briefing. They will feel it at the airport, standing in a TSA line that is barely moving, watching boarding time creep closer, watching irritation turn into panic. Because that is how institutional instability enters ordinary life. Not through policy language, through missed flights, delayed reunions, rebooked tickets, frayed nerves, and the sickening sense that a fight in Washington is now reaching into your time, your money, and your peace of mind. And the airport may be only the most visible part of the damage. Before we go further, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you want coverage that shows how Washington power fights turn into real-life consequences, subscribe and stay with us. Most Americans do not think about DHS when everything is working. They think about getting through security, catching a flight crossing a checkpoint, or trusting that when disaster hits, someone is still in charge. But that invisible layer of normal life rests on one huge machine, the Department of Homeland Security. DHS is not just another Washington acronym. It sits behind airport screening through TSA border and customs enforcement through CBP, disaster response through FEMA, and there's a long list of systems meant to keep movement entry and emergency response from slipping into chaos. It touches airports, ports of entry, storm zones, and the quiet infrastructure of domestic security. In other words, it does not just manage crises. It protects routine. That is why this matters to ordinary people. When DHS is stable, daily life feels smooth enough that most people never notice it. But when it is pulled into budget fights, leadership fights, or political brinkmanship, the damage does not stay inside government. It leaks outward into lines, delays, stress, confusion, and the public's growing sense that something essential is being forced to operate on uncertainty. And once a system this central starts living that way, this was never just a Washington personnel fight. What makes this fight more dangerous is that it is not just one fight, it is two. A funding fight over how the department should operate, and a leadership fight over who gets to command it. Money and control, payroll and power, and both are colliding inside one of the most sensitive agencies in the country. That is what turns a normal Washington standoff into something darker. Publicly, both sides say they are defending security, restoring order, or protecting the country from bad policy. But behind that language is a much harsher truth. DHS is being used as leverage. One side treats funding as pressure. The other treats confirmation as pressure. Each camp insists the stakes are too high to back down. And while that battle plays out under lights behind microphones and across Senate desks, the department itself is forced to operate inside uncertainty. That uncertainty is the real story, because DHS is not built to function as a bargaining chip. It is built to manage risk movement emergencies and national security responsibilities that do not pause just because Washington is locked in another political test of will. But that is exactly what is happening now. The people arguing say this is about principle. The system living through it feels something else entirely strain. And once strain enters an agency like this, it does not stay abstract for long. It becomes slower decisions, weaker morale, harder planning, and a dangerous gap between the image of control in Washington and the reality of a department being asked to hold the line while politicians keep pulling at both ends. And the first people to feel it may not be politicians at all. This is where the fight stops sounding political and starts feeling physical. At the airport, in the line. In that slow, tightening moment when the clock moves faster than the checkpoint. TSA is often the first place ordinary Americans would feel DHS instability because airport security has no room for drift. When funding lapses drag on, officers are asked to keep the system moving, while pay, morale, and staffing are all under pressure. Reuters reported that about 50,000 TSA officers have been working without pay. National absences were near 10%, and some airports saw far higher call-out rates with closed checkpoints and long waits in places like Houston, New Orleans, and Atlanta, Reuters. And once that starts, the damage spreads fast. A longer screening line is never just a longer screening line. It becomes a missed boarding window, a missed connection, a rebooking fee, a child crying in a terminal, a family vacation starting in panic instead of relief. Reuters reported some travelers were facing security waits approaching 3 hours with flights delayed and passengers missing departures. Reuters. That is why travel feels the shock so quickly. It is crowded, visible, emotional, and unforgiving. The public may not follow every Senate maneuver or budget vote, but they understand a checkpoint that is not moving. But the delays are only the symptom people can see. But the airport is only the front window of this problem. The same department caught in this fight also sits at the border and at the country's ports of entry where Customs and Border Protection handles inspections for people and goods arriving by air, land, and sea. All of that lives under the DHS umbrella. That is why this story gets bigger the moment you stop thinking about TSA alone. A department already strained by a funding lapse tied to immigration negotiations is not just managing spring break checkpoints. It is also carrying the pressure of border enforcement, customs flow, and entry processing, while Washington keeps treating the whole system like a bargaining table. And when a security system starts operating that way, the risk is not only inconvenience, it is distortion. Priorities get pulled by politics. Managers spend energy surviving uncertainty instead of reducing it. The public sees delays at the airport, but the deeper strain is that one of the country's core movement and security systems is being forced to run tense, because travel friction is only where the public first notices the strain. And this is where the story gets heavier, because DHS is not only about checkpoints and boarding times. FEMA is part of DHS too, and FEMA is the agency Americans look to when storms hit fires, spread floods rise, and local systems start breaking under pressure. In other words, this fight is not just brushing against travel. It is brushing against the government's ability to react when ordinary life turns into emergency. That is what makes prolonged uncertainty so dangerous. In February, Reuters reported that during the DHS funding lapse, FEMA staff were told a DHS stop travel order did include disaster travel, leaving hundreds of disaster responders preparing for assignments ordered to stand down even as DHS said travel to active disasters would continue. That is the kind of contradiction that should make people uneasy. It suggests a system trying to reassure the public while parts of the machinery are already being forced into emergency triage. And that is the deeper risk behind the airport delays, not just inconvenience, vulnerability. Because when Washington keeps a national security department living in suspense, the country is not only gambling with missed flights, it is gambling with response time coordination and public trust in the exact moments when speed matters most. And that is where inconvenience starts turning into vulnerability. This is the point where delays stop being just delays. They become a test of trust. When travelers hear officials say the system is holding but then walk into closed checkpoints, missed flights, and security lines stretching for hours, something bigger starts to break. Reuters reported that the DHS funding lapse had entered its 33rd day with about 50,000 TSA officers working without pay absenteeism near 10% nationally, and some airports seeing far worse staffing gaps. That gap between reassurance and lived reality is dangerous. People do not judge government capacity by press releases. They judge it by whether the line moves, whether the flight is missed, whether the system still looks like someone is in control. And when the visible front edge of Homeland Security starts looking strained, the public rarely confines that doubt to one terminal. It spreads outward, from TSA to DHS. From delays to competence, from inconvenience to a darker question about whether the machinery of the state is being forced to run on politics instead of stability. Reuters and AP both describe a department under simultaneous funding pressure and leadership scrutiny as Markwayne Mullin seeks confirmation amid the operational fallout. That is why this fight carries more damage than a long airport line. Because behind every stalled checkpoint is a growing suspicion that one of the country's most important security systems is being kept in suspense by political deadlock. And behind the delays is a much bigger risk. And this is the point where the story stops being about inconvenience and becomes a question about how much national security can be left hanging in political suspense. Because DHS is not one office with one headache. It is the umbrella over TSA, CBP, and FEMA. The systems people rely on to screen airports, manage ports of entry, and respond when disaster hits. At the same time, the department is being squeezed by a funding lapse tied to immigration negotiations while its leadership fight plays out in public. That is what makes this moment so dangerous. Not just the delays, not just the optics, the precedent. If a department this central can be forced to operate in uncertainty while politicians use money and confirmation as leverage, then the real message is bigger than one bad week at the airport. It is that the systems meant to protect daily American life can be left in suspension while Washington tests who blinks first. And that is the high-stakes question behind all of this. How much of national security is really being protected and how much of it is being used? Because once a government starts treating essential security machinery like a bargaining chip, the damage goes beyond travel. It reaches trust. It reaches readiness. It reaches the public's belief that when something serious happens, the people in charge will already be focused on the country, not still fighting over the steering wheel. And ordinary Americans are usually the first to pay for elite deadlock. By this point, the cost to ordinary Americans is no longer theoretical. It is measured in time, money, and the slow erosion of peace of mind. A long TSA line means more than inconvenience. It can mean waking up earlier, paying to change a ticket, missing a connection, losing a hotel night, or starting a family trip already angry and exhausted. Reuters reported travelers facing waits of up to 3 hours at some airports during the DHS funding lapse, with missed flights and closed checkpoints turning bureaucratic dysfunction into personal loss. And that is the pattern that matters. The people creating the deadlock are not the first to absorb the damage. The public is. The traveler with a child in line. The worker trying to get home. The family watching a carefully planned trip start to unravel. What looks like a Washington standoff on television becomes a tax on ordinary life in the real world. That is why the airport matters so much in this story. Not because it is the biggest risk, but because it is where the damage becomes visible. It is the place where people can actually see what happens when an essential system is forced to operate under political strain. The airport was only where the damage became visible. In the end, this is what the DHS fight really exposes. A country does not measure the strength of its institutions only when everything is calm. It measures them when politics turns vicious and the systems people depend on still have to work anyway. DHS is not a symbolic agency. It sits over TSA, CBP, and FEMA, the parts of government people meet at airports, ports of entry, and in disasters. That is why this story lands so hard. A funding lapse tied to immigration negotiations has stretched past a month, about 50,000 TS. Officers have been working without pay, absenteeism has remained elevated, and the department is also trying to navigate a contentious confirmation fight over Markwayne Mullin. So the real question is not whether Washington can survive another political showdown. It can. The real question is whether the public should be the first to absorb the cost every time. Essential security machinery is forced to live in uncertainty. When critical systems are left hanging, ordinary people pay first, with time, money, and the loss of simple confidence that the country is being run with steadiness instead of brinkmanship. A strong state is not defined only by how loudly it talks about security. It is defined by whether the systems behind that promise remain reliable when politics gets ugly. That is the deeper lesson here. When airport screening, border operations, and disaster response are pulled into a fight over leverage, the first thing people lose is not just convenience. It is trust. And once trust starts slipping, every line feels longer, every delay feels heavier, and every official reassurance sounds thinner. DHS was created to reduce vulnerability, not become part of it. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are right now. And if you want more videos that explain how Washington power fights turn into real-world consequences for travel security and daily life, subscribe and stay with us.